Okay, so people are being let in. So we'll give it maybe 2 minutes for everyone to come in, and then I will start. Okay, welcome everybody who has joined us today online for the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress's webinar on Canada-Ukraine Partners in Security. We are very glad to bring to you 3 expert speakers today, who I will introduce very shortly. My name is Orest Zakidalski. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. A couple of housekeeping items. We will have 3 speakers give remarks, and then there will be a Q&A with the audience. We ask that you write in your questions in either the chat or the Q&A function, and please feel free to do so as the speakers are addressing us. And then after the addresses, I will compile the questions that you send in, and we will ask the speakers. This session is being recorded, and if we don't get to your question, please, I will tell you how to email it to us, and hopefully we can get it answered that way. So joining us today is Dr. Alexander Lanushka, who is the Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo, and Associate Fellow at the United Kingdom-based Council on Geostrategy, as well as a Senior Fellow at the Ottawa-based Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Dr. David Perry is the President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and host of the Institute's Defense Deconstructed podcast and co-director of the Triple Helix Minds Collaborate Network. And he is adjunct professor at the Center for Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. Jill Sinclair is senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and she is a strategic defense reform advisor working with the Department of National Defense. She served for 7 years as assistant deputy minister of policy at the Department of National Defense, and she was the senior official and led the effort for Canada when Canada hosted the 2019 Ukraine Reform Conference. And bringing opening remarks and greetings on behalf of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress is Alexandra Khichi, the national president of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, in which role she has served since 2018. The UCC is the umbrella organization that unites and advocates on behalf of Canada's 1.4 million Ukrainian Canadians. Alexandra Khichi is a lawyer by profession, and for over 25 years has led prominent legal associations like the Advocate Society and the Canadian Corporate Counsel Association. And since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, she has been our community's leading voice in shaping our and Canada's response to the war and advocating for the need to assist Ukraine in defending itself and the need for Canada to support Ukrainian victory. As I said, our topic today is Canada and Ukraine partners in security. And President Khichi, I turn it over to you for opening remarks and context setting, please.
Thank you, Orest, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress is very pleased to host this impressive panel of experts who will speak about the Canada-Ukraine security relationship and also the broader geopolitical context of Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine. Today, we see a renewed Russian offensive in Kharkiv Oblast. Ukrainian villages that were liberated in 2022 by the Ukrainian armed forces are once again occupied by the Russian army. Vovchansk has been razed to the ground by Russian missiles as the Russians try to capture the city. On Monday, U.S. Secretary of State Lloyd Austin stated that the Kremlin's forces will try to make further advances in the weeks ahead and will try to carve out a buffer zone along the Ukrainian border. Even though Ukraine has defended the freedom of Europe for almost 3 years, our allies have still not provided Ukraine with the weapons, ammunition, and aid that is needed to push the Russians out of Ukrainian territory and to liberate all of Ukraine's people from brutal Russian occupation. The delay in the American aid package, which was finally passed in April, caused tremendous difficulty for Ukraine and ought to serve as a wake-up call for NATO allies. Now is the time to step up and take a more active role in the defense of Europe and in assistance to Ukraine. Standing with Ukraine cannot be an empty promise or, worse yet, a cliche. We are soon approaching 2 critical international events: President Zelensky's Peace Summit in June in Switzerland and the NATO Summit this July in Washington. And of course, in November, the US presidential election looms. It is in that context that the security relationship between Canada and Ukraine is developing. It is a key priority of the UCC and the community we serve that this relationship between Canada and Ukraine develop and strengthen more deeply and more quickly. So thank you again to our expert speakers for offering their timely analysis today, and thank you to everyone who is joining us. We look forward to an engaging and captivating discussion.
Thank you. I will now ask Dr. Wanushka to give us his brief remarks on the sort of wider context in which our discussion is taking place. So please, Dr. Wanushka.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to come speak to you alongside such an illustrious group as Jill and David. I'm very much appreciative of this opportunity. So I've been asked to provide somewhat of a strategic overview as one can do over the course of 5 minutes. The problem set to me is a very obvious one. Russia, throughout the last several years, has expressed very maximal aims, notwithstanding whatever is happening on the battlefield. Whether it suffers tactical or even strategic reverses, the rhetoric from the Kremlin remains unchanged. It is the interest on the part of the Kremlin to effectively destroy the Ukrainian nation, to install some sort of regime in its place, and to effectively widen the scope of Russian occupation. Now, as I mentioned, Russia has experienced tactical difficulties over the course of the last few years. And indeed, those difficulties were most significant in 2022. Yet I think over the course of that particular year, amidst all the triumph that seemed to attend Ukraine's own successes in various counteroffensives, there was a subtle shift in Russian thinking towards this war that I think went largely unnoticed. We tended to congratulate ourselves at that time for providing the military weapons that we did to Ukraine, and we were very happy with what Ukraine was able to do. At the same time, Putin appeared very sick, very nervous, and it very much appeared that Russia was on the back foot. But I think sometime in that spring or even summer of 2022, there was some understanding reached in the Kremlin that this war is going to be a very long one. And I think as a result of that psychological shift, they were able to mentally prepare themselves for what would be a much longer campaign, certainly much longer than that which they had expected prior to launching the full-scale invasion. And so over the course of the late fall into the early winter of 2022 and early 2023, they dug in, and they dug in very well. That for all the incompetence that we saw of Russian infantry and of other Russian military units, Russian army engineers were very effective in digging in and creating a system of fortifications that would render any such repeat of the Kharkiv or Kherson even counteroffensives difficult to replicate. And I think, unfortunately, we are in this world still whereby Russia has mobilized to a certain extent to ensure that they can hold territory in a way that was not necessarily possible in 2022, while thinking to themselves that they can play a much longer game with the West than what was initially expected. And certainly, even people like me thought this war would not last as long as it has in view of what was happening in 2022. So Russia has had this edge. They've been able to reconstitute a number of their military forces. They were able to replenish their ammunition, perhaps on the assumption that the West would eventually lose some of its focus and its geostrategic attention would be diverted elsewhere. And so when we come to NATO, the other side of the strategic ledger, the good news is that, especially in the last 6 or so months, European countries have become much more willing to step up to address some of the shortfalls created by the lack of American support between the late fall and early spring of this year, that we are seeing ammunition production increase manifold across the European alliance, that there is a convergence of understanding even amongst Western European capitals that this war is going to be much longer than what had been anticipated in 2022. But unfortunately, there are a number of gaps that remain. I do not want to steal some of David's own speaking points because he'll relate his own particular views on the defense update very shortly, but there's still so much that needs to be done. That Canada, for instance, remains fairly derelict, as if I may say, as regards to ammunition production. That, as what the president had just mentioned, there have been a number of pledges made, but deliveries still seem to be very much delayed. That ammunition production still remains very much constrained and certainly not at the levels as what we're expecting. With respect to the NATO summit as such, I just don't expect very much. It'll be mostly symbolic. And I'm afraid that the question of Ukraine membership will be more or less held in abeyance to then. So again, just to wrap things up, Russia, I think, realized earlier than us that this is a longer game, and we have paid dearly for it in the sense that we've failed to properly deliver what Ukraine needs to achieve strategic victory. But the good news is that we are starting to wake up to that reality, and we are starting to increase the supplies accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Oanoshka. I'll now ask Dr. Perry to give us some remarks, particularly on the new Canada Defence Review update and Canadian investments in defense production and what we should be doing more of.
Sure. So first, let me just echo thanks for the invitation to appear. This is an important topic. It's one that I think, unfortunately, has been fading from a lot of the public view. That happens with time, but I don't think the importance of a Ukrainian victory for the Ukrainian people, for Western security, for Canadian security is any different today than it was on the 22nd of February of 2022. So it's important to keep these conversations going. And I actually think in a way, I hope that this becomes a bit of an election issue in Canada to re-energize some of that debate in a way that I think has actually faded. I'd offer a couple of comments to situate in the context of our new defense policy, which I think on my read essentially reaffirms the importance of this issue. The Euro-Atlantic region remains a key geostrategic flashpoint, a key source of tension, a key source of insecurity. And on my read of the new defense policy, it's reaffirmed the need to continue making the kinds of contributions Canada has through Op Unifier, through our other NATO arrangements, as well as direct on a government-to-government or bilateral basis with Ukraine. I think it's also done a couple of other things that might be helpful in the long term. One is, I think on my read, our new defense policy is a bit more focused a clear orientation around North America and Canada, and the Indo-Pacific, and then the Euro-Atlantic. I think it's pretty hard to read that as anything but a signal that we're going to be more geographically focused, which potentially beneficial over the long term. And as has been mentioned, there's been some initial nods towards making some moves to increase some additional defense production. Some discussion and some commitment of funding about ammunition production in particular, and some other discussion about reinvigorating the defense industrial base and the relationship with Canadian defense industry. And I think that's all to the good, but these are the kinds of things that ideally we would have been doing 2 years ago. It's better to do them now, but 2 years ago would have been a lot better, and a year ago, kind of a middle ground. And I think we have to be realistic in terms of tempering expectations about when this might be and when this might start putting Canada in a position to provide additional assistance. And I think realistically, we're talking 2 to 3 years down the road on the current trajectory with the additional investments that we're talking about. And I think given that, it leaves us in the situation today where I think bluntly Canada is less prepared from a material standpoint in terms of what we have in this country, and that we have started producing for material support in some ways. We're worse off and less able to help than we were 2.5 years ago, because we've burned down a lot of our own stockpiles. We've raided, I think at this point, basically everything out of the Canadian Army's equipment holdings that we are able to, at least with the current sets of assumptions. And I think one of the things that this conflict and the horrible things that have happened have exposed, broadly speaking, Canada, the West writ large, absolutely not prepared for this type of conflict. And I think that's true both in terms of a material sense. We don't have enough ammunition stockpiles, we didn't have enough stores, we didn't have enough depth in our weapon systems, we don't have enough stocks of the basic supplies for soldiers, we don't have enough soldiers, we don't have a whole lot of things, but I think it's also exposed to limitation in mindset. My colleague just talked about the sort of the timeframes here. I do think that there was an element of predictability that authoritarian dictatorships have a tendency to be able to take wars and drag them out. They just don't care about their own people the same kind of way. And if you remove that constraint, you can do a lot of things, unfortunately, that can extend timelines. And because of that lack of orientation around that, we didn't have a lot of these. We didn't have a lot of these holdings, and we've been, I think, unfortunately slow to re-engage to try and reinvest in them. And we are still employing, I think, in a lot of ways, kind of fairly traditional thinking, and we are applying, I think, unfortunately, more or less bureaucracy as usual to an existential problem, and not trying to put ourselves in the Ukrainian shoes when we're looking at the utility of different pieces of equipment, particularly when it comes to things like items that Canada is considering for disposal, where in my opinion, we should be basically trying to find a mechanism to allow the Ukrainian forces to come in and inventory everything we have, and if they want it, hand it over, particularly if we're not going to be using it ourselves. I do still think that there's time, though. I think, unfortunately, we're looking at a longer conflict, which does mean that even actions we take today that may not pay off in terms of real material differences for another 2 or 3 years are absolutely worth doing today so that they can pay off in 2 or 3 years. And maybe there's some options to pull some of those timelines forward a bit and accelerate some things. And the faster we start moving on that, the faster that they can start to bear some fruit. I do think, though, that we need to be more coordinated than it has not appeared to me and the folks that I've talked to in our own defense industrial base that there is much coherence, that there's much organization, that there's much structure, repeatability to how Canada has approached donating defense material to Ukraine. It's been episodic. There's been some moves to stretch it out over a longer timeline and introduce some more predictability. But I think there's a lot of room to expand and to grow the organization of this to be better at inventorying what we have, what Ukraine needs, and what Canada could realistically step up to supply. And as was noted earlier, there's a lot of waiting around for the American aid package donation. And, obviously that's because the United States has been the largest donor. But I think that's exposed a whole bunch of shortcomings and limitations that everybody else in the West and everyone else in NATO should be seized with, of realizing just how reliant we are on the United States. And that is something that we need to start fixing, where I don't think we're going to be able to just eradicate the equivalent of a dependency on the Americans for something like 60 billion worth of material stocks for Ukraine, but we can start, I think, changing the ratio of dependence. And if we're at 95% to 5% in terms of reliance on American stockpiles, we should be working towards incrementally shifting that ratio as quickly as we can, so that everybody else, Canada included, can start picking up a bigger share of what we should be contributing, both for our own interest, but as well as for those of our European friends and Ukrainians in particular. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I will now turn it over to Jill Sinclair to speak about the relatively new Canada-Ukraine security agreement and Ukrainian defense reforms and defense production reforms. Please, Jill Sinclair.
Well, thanks, Eeyore. Thanks, Alexandra. Thanks for bringing us all together, Orest. Thank you. You know, I'm glad we started off by reminding ourselves how important it is to talk about this issue. So thanks to everybody online. I was just listening to the interview that President Zelensky gave with the New York Times. It may have been yesterday or perhaps the day before. But, you know, he was talking about the importance of just keeping this front of mind, with more than 20%, you know, of Ukraine still under occupation, 7 million people still abroad, this war still raging. You know, people are starting to forget. And obviously, every phase of the news cycle brings more chaos in the world that distracts attention. But I'm grateful to David and to Alex for reminding us that this is an existential fight. And I want to just say a few things about the sort of under this theme of partners in security, because I think this is really an important point. Ukraine is a partner in our security, and I know this sounds rhetorical and easy to say, but it's been said so many times that we run the risk of forgetting the real meaning behind it, and that there is in effect the elements of a global war going on, and Ukraine is very much at the front lines of that. And so looking at Ukraine as a true partner in security. And I just want to, you know, remind people or just refresh people's memories that Ukraine has not come recently to being a partner in Euro-Atlantic security. Before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine participated with NATO in NATO missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the Black Sea. So there is a tradition here of working with Ukraine in partnership in security, because Ukraine is a democratic country on a Euro-Atlantic trajectory and will be a member of NATO. When that will happen, we can have a discussion about that and what that means in practical terms en route. But I think this idea of partnership, there is a reciprocal relationship here. And I really want to stress that it isn't just since the full-scale invasion by Russia, but we have been learning from Ukraine for years about the new ways of warfare, about the role of cyber, about the role of disinformation and misinformation. Let's just call it what it is. It's lies and propaganda by Russia and other despots around the world. We've been learning a lot about electronic warfare. We've been learning about what it means to be a resilient society and resilient democracy in the face of such aggression. And I think, again, if you talk about partners in security, your partners help your awareness. Your partners help you challenge your assumptions. And I think both David and Alex have mentioned this, that the mindset of the West, of Europe, of Canada, the United States even, has been of a different sort. And this is an opportunity to really raise that awareness. Now, I know we've heard a lot about what we're not doing, and I'm just going to say a couple of things about what we are doing. And again, really happy to be challenged on all of this, but there are some realities of what Canada has been doing for a number of years. We have a training mission. I think it was Alex who mentioned passing Op Unifier. That's our training mission. You know, we're working with the UK, we're working with the Poles, with the Germans. We're offering this training in a very flexible way, which is responding to Ukrainian requirements. It's one of the great things about the Canadian program, is that it's quite flexible in responding to that. We're training recruits, we're training engineers. For those of us who don't know too much about, you know, what military engineers do, this is counter mine, this is counter improvised explosive device. It's extremely important on the battlefield. And we've been doing this for a number of years. Canada's in capability coalitions. This is working with like-minded partners in some pretty specific areas: armored vehicles, Air Force training, and in drones. This is the leading edge of 21st century warfare. And then there is, as you mentioned, Orest, the 2024 Canada-Ukraine Strategic Security Partnership. It's an agreement. It's a bilateral security partnership agreement. And, you know, it covers an awful lot of things. It includes information exchange. It includes political consultations. It includes working together on defense reform, on increasing and improving our defense industrial base, notwithstanding the challenges that others have mentioned here. And I'm not minimizing those, but this is a framework, and it is a floor, not a ceiling, of where this partnership and cooperation can go between two trusted democratic partners. This is a framework within which Canada will help Ukraine meet NATO interoperability requirements to become a functioning member of the alliance in political and military terms. Extremely important. And Canada is not the only country that has one of these agreements. There was a decision that came out of the Vilnius summit by G7 leaders about a year ago. And in the ensuing months, there are now more than 30 states that are working on these bilateral defense partnership arrangements with Ukraine. This is extremely important, and it brings me to my next point, which is I think it's really important to look at security in the wider context. Obviously, there is the existential day-to-day battlefield needs that Ukraine has, and nobody expresses that more eloquently or more frequently or more pointedly than President Zelensky. But there is wider security. And I think keeping an eye on the long term, because we're looking at Ukraine's security over the long term. We're looking at Ukraine being victorious in this war, achieving its objectives, and then being victorious also in peace. And that means things like macroeconomic stability, extremely important. Canada has been doing some work here with the international financial institutions, things like energy security. I mean, again, we've sort of forgotten, you know, Zaporizhia, which everybody learned how to pronounce a few months ago. Nobody talks about now, but nuclear safety and security, extremely important, both for the safety part of it, but obviously for Ukraine's energy security, which we know is under a great deal of stress at the moment. Canada's been, you know, a leading force there, working with the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, to help get those missions in there to deal with the safety and security issues. And then there's the issue of sanctions. Again, we can have a great debate about how effective, how not, but trying to deal with those who are end-running sanctions. And again, just yesterday, or what might have been the day before, Canada announced a new package targeting the DPRK, these proxy supporters who are enabling Russia in all sorts of extraordinary ways at great and lucrative kind of results to themselves. So all of these things contribute to a broader kind of security envelope. And if you're going to be truly a partner in security, we have to look at those longer term pieces that will build the economic, the institutional, the political, the democratic resilience that Ukrainians have shown that they have in enormous quantities. But we cannot continue to squander those quantities of that quantity of resilience that they have. We do have to do more. I agree with my colleagues here that we do have to do more, but it's a question of making sure that we have the right packages that address issues like food security, that address issues like cultural security of Ukraine, deal with things like the children who have been illegally, you know, taken from Ukraine. So there are a lot of elements when you're dealing with a partnership in security. And I guess I would just end by referring to something that Alexandra mentioned, and that is the Peace Summit that's taking place June 15th and 16th. And everybody will say, yeah, summits, who cares? Yeah, more rhetoric. Yeah, and it is a lot of rhetoric. But I don't think we should underestimate the importance of being able to demonstrate globally with a diverse array of countries what peace really means. Peace in terms of the UN Charter, peace in terms of territorial integrity, peace along the lines that Ukraine has outlined in their peace formula, which doesn't mean just giving up chunks of territory because you have a nasty neighbor who decides to take a bite out of you. And so supporting Ukraine in this peace summit, supporting it politically, in making sure that the global South understands what's at stake here. And this is the enterprise of Russia to violate every notion of the UN Charter, to violate the territorial integrity of a sovereign state. And so when we talk about partners in security, we are learning from Ukraine, we are contributing to that security partnership. We are getting a lot of value and lessons learned that should make us stronger partners in Euro-Atlantic security and in building democratic resilience in our own country. So I think I'll stop here so we have lots of time for comments. Over.
So thank you very much to our three panelists. Again, I remind our guests online that you can use the either the chat or the Q&A function to write in your the Q&A function to write in questions that we will I'll compile and put to our panelists. I want to start with one that Jill, you sort of touched on, which was sanctions, and we have what seems to be growing momentum amongst both the G7 and the European Union to use both the seized Russian assets that we have in the West and if not using the actual assets, then certainly there's probably broader agreement on using the interest that's coming off of those assets or growing that's being accumulated in Western financial institutions. So I'd open it up to any of you to sort of what are the actual prospects of using these assets in the near future to be able to fund some of the support that Western countries are providing to Ukraine. And please, anyone who'd like to go first.
Well, I can start off if you like, Orest, but I would just note that just in the last day, the EU has spoken publicly about this, that they are actually looking at the modalities for beginning to use these seized assets, the interest. There are a lot of legal complexities about it, but they are looking at how to feed that right back into military capability for Ukraine. And again, Canada has been part of those discussions. And when it comes to sort of, the sanctions regimes, I talked about North Korea, Iran, obviously, and Russia itself. We've seen that sanctions are, they have a political effect, but it is far too easy to work around them. And so closing all those loopholes and then making Russia pay a practical price by using those seized assets in one way or another. As I say, the EU is starting to lead the way there. Over.
Anyone like to add to that? Okay, we have a question from one of our guests about the Canadian training missions and how they operate. The question is, do we know how many troops and instructors from Canada are involved in the training missions? And I would add to that a second question, which is, what are the prospects of those missions, not just Canada's, but other allied missions, returning to Ukrainian territory, which is where they were mostly based before the full-scale invasion in 2022.
So I could take again a stab. Oh, David, do you want to go? Go ahead.
I was just going to say currently it's authorized up to about 300 people. So it's given the state of the Canadian Army right now, I think it's proportionally pretty significant in terms of what we can actually contribute. I would echo what Jill said. I mean, I think that we've been doing a lot on the training front. In my prior comments, I don't say to diminish what Canada's done. I think it's very clearly that we all need to think about what more above the current baseline of the last 2 years we're able to do, given what was laid out at the outset in terms of the trajectory of the fighting right now. So keeping on doing more of the same things, I don't think is going to be sufficient to get the outcome for Ukraine that we all want. So we need to think about ways to enhance that. So things like adding on to initiatives like the fighter capability training, where we could, as an example, or some other forms of training. I do think I am a little curious to know, and I haven't seen much offered about this, and maybe Jill knows. I think in a lot of ways the Ukrainians have outpaced us in a huge way in terms of all the actual tactics and techniques they're using for the modern battlefield, because Canadian soldiers haven't been in a fight like this with the combination of both conventional approaches and modern military modern military gear, and the combination of those tactics, we've basically never been in this kind of fight at some levels. So a lot that I think that we're learning from them. But I think that we're probably bumping up against the limits of how many more people we can actually put into the training programs out of the Canadian Forces, given the overall shortages.
I can add to that if you would like, Oresta. Yeah, you're right, David. It's about 300 Canadian Armed Forces members, and they're both, they're doing training. They're also helping in this coordination of the equipment and the delivery of equipment as it gets to Ukraine, and probably trained upwards of about 5,000 folks at the moment. That's just since Russia's full-scale invasion. If we go back to the beginning of the training mission, it's sort of around 30,000 folks who have been through Canadian training. Orest, you asked about, when can that happen back in Ukraine? I'm amongst the very fortunate people who used to go back and forth to Ukraine. I was in Yavoriv where we were doing our training. Absolutely fabulous. Everybody wants to get back there. I think that Minister Blair just recently said that, once conditions permit, Canada can return to training in Ukraine. Now, what those conditions mean in specific terms, I don't know, but I think it's encouraging, and actually it's written into this bilateral security agreement that we have, that once conditions permit, we will go back to Ukraine. So I think it's for all of us to continue to ask, well, what are those conditions and when can we get back there? Because certainly in terms of the battlefield requirements of the Ukrainians, the closer to the battlefield in safe space that this is done, the more effective it's going to be. And just to add to what David said about the Ukrainians outpacing us, yes, unfortunately, one learns too much on the battlefield. But in terms of asymmetric hybrid warfare, drones, electronic warfare, creative uses of space, communications, there's no questions that the Ukrainians, we are learning more from the Ukrainians, and that we as NATO, it's not just Canada, and includes the United States of America, than they are learning from us at the moment, though there are still some foundational interoperable things that NATO was bringing to them on a bilateral basis. Over.
So we have two related questions. So the first one is the observation that Western allies have been ready to arm Ukraine enough to keep fighting, but not enough to win, has seemed sadly true. What is needed now to change this? And then a related question is there amongst Ukraine and Ukraine's allies a game plan to end the war and win the war? And what is the sort of coordinated, comprehensive plan around a strategic Ukrainian victory? So again, open it up to.
I can perhaps answer that question, at least make the first stab at it. So I think that impression is correct, or at least it's very well justified. I do think that what we're seeing with respect to the delays in deliveries and some of the lack of fulfillment of certain pledges relate to is that for the longest time, even after 2014, Western militaries were just simply not benefiting from much investment, that there has been chronic underfunding across the NATO alliance since the end of the Cold War. And so, at least in my own research conducted with Jordan Becker of West Point, the countries that gave the most military assistance in 2022 happen to be those countries that had spent more on their militaries, in particularly in operations and maintenance. In other words, they were strategically prepared for undertaking deployments, intensive training missions, and so forth, such that their militaries were sufficiently well-resourced, such that when something like the full-scale invasion broke out, they were able to provide equipment. And so what we're seeing on the part of Canada, which I think has only satisfied about half, if barely, its pledges to provide military assistance, is just simply an artifact of all those years underinvesting in the militaries. So to answer the first question, it's just a matter of making those investments, such that, as David said, even if the result is not necessarily immediate, you'll reap the dividends a year, 2 years, 3 years from now.
I just would add to that is, I mean, I think I do not at all envy in any shape or form planners in Ukraine trying to deal with the fact that they don't actually control production, and they're in a very difficult when it comes to the supply of material and ammunition. By and large, I know there's some nationalized production, but it's fundamentally different to do that inside and outside of Russian missile range. There's lots of other places, Canada's one of them, but also elsewhere in Europe, where we're trying to align production capacity, which is ill-suited, as I said earlier, to the current type of conflict. Our whole Western defense industrial base is not postured for conflict like this. We were calibrated for several decades to do asymmetric operations, peacekeeping, stabilization missions, counterinsurgency, all of which had totally different orders of magnitude, smaller requirements for production. And we've also been spending a couple of generations going down a trajectory of developing exquisite weapon systems, which do wonderful things, but in small quantities. And we've seen that there's entirely, I think, unappreciated quality to having vast quantities of production that Russia has had stockpiles, has been able to ramp up faster than we have, even under the sanctions regime. I think in a way that the West collectively should find a little embarrassing. A country that has, been under a whole raft of international financial constraints. Yes, there's ways to evade that, but with all those measures, they are outproducing us. And trying to really crack through that is both critically important to Ukraine, but it also, I think, in a wider context for NATO, thinking about authoritarian dictatorships that are not going to go away. We need to get a lot better at being able to get back to the days of the arsenals of democracy in a big hurry.
To the second question, I totally forgot to answer it, but I think one problem that we're seeing on the part of various Western governments is the lack of a game plan. There's a lot of talk about being with Ukraine for as long as it takes, but not necessarily being with Ukraine for what is needed to achieve strategic victory. And this has become very frustrating, especially with respect to the Biden administration. Yes, it's great that they provide $60 billion worth of assistance, much of which is military. But we saw even today frustration on the part of key Republican politicians that the Biden administration has placed particular restrictions on the use of certain weapons such that they cannot be used against targets located on Russian soil. And that has complicated, of course, Ukrainian efforts to defend itself against the onslaught in around Kharkiv Oblast. So that lack of a game plan becomes all the more apparent when we're seeing large packages, is that which the United States thankfully has given, but at the same time done in such a way as to restrict particular uses that would actually be important for Ukraine to minimize casualties and to achieve important tactical, if not strategic, outcomes.
So our next question is on, so Ukraine has demonstrated drones as one of the most significant new developments in military affairs. Do you believe that Canada is properly reconfiguring its military to address this reality and to better support our allies?
Not fast enough.
I would just say that, yes, not fast enough, but the reason why Ukraine has depended so much on drones as it has is because it doesn't have sufficient numbers of artillery. And so drones have been very useful, and I don't want to diminish the impact that they've had on the battlefield, although an individual drone barely lasts 2 days. The fact of the matter is that they are a measure to compensate for the lack of artillery and certain types of ammunition. If Ukraine could swap a lot of its drones for 155 millimeter artillery shells, I'm sure it would make that wager all the same.
I'd just like to add a word on that rest. Yeah, I mean, drones are not going to be a substitute for air defenses and all the things that we know Ukraine needs, but we've seen massively creative use of drones by Ukraine. This goes before Russia's full-scale invasion. But if you just look at how they have used them in the Black Sea, they are using them and deploying them in extremely creative ways. And whilst they don't have, they can't scale up, defense production capability in the way they would like to domestically, when it comes to producing drones, the flash to bang is pretty quick. The innovation is absolutely extraordinary. The move from the battlefield experience back into the labs and then back into the battlefield is a constant cycle of improvement and refinement, which unfortunately the Russians are learning also, that's what the Ukrainians are doing. And I mean, I'm no expert here, but I wouldn't diminish the role of drones in the future face of warfare. We're seeing it played out now. There is this drone capability coalition that Canada is a member of, and it certainly figures in the defense policy update. And it's something we're going to need, and they are used in all sorts of different, and as I say, very creative ways on the battlefield. Over.
On capabilities, we have a question about where and what at which stage is the provision of the F-16 jets to Ukraine?
I'm not sure. And I mean, I think one thing I would just say that I think at various points there's been a fixation on a particular weapon system as being the magic answer. And I think we need to shift out of that mindset a little bit. A lot of these can provide a huge number of capabilities that can be employed effectively and in combination with a bunch of other assets. I think having additional air power can potentially be highly beneficial, but I worry that we've put a lot of stock into dramatically better things happening just with the deployment of F-16s. I think the Russians have shown that they're actually a lot better than we thought initially, or they demonstrated they were initially at being able to adapt and counter newly deployed equipment on the battlefield. But I know that they're coming at some point and they will provide a benefit, but they're not going to be a silver bullet, I don't think.
So I would say that F-16s would have been great a year ago when Ukraine had begun its counteroffensive. After all, one key problem that Ukrainian armed forces had faced along the front line were Russian attack helicopters that more or less were able to defend strong points with relative impunity. Of course, there were a number of helicopters that would suffer attrition on the Russian side, but F-16s would have been certainly useful in clearing the air. For the type of war that we're currently seeing, perhaps less useful. I'm not sure what the answer would be to, for example, the glide bombs that Russia has been using to pulverize settlements in Kharkiv Oblast. I tend to think of F-16s as being useful for the next war, unfortunately, that Ukraine will probably fight with Russia. But for this current conflict, I tend to think that the window of opportunity for F-16s being maximally useful has unfortunately passed.
Orest, I just want to jump in on this, slightly at variance with my colleagues, but I mean, I think F-16s you just can't dismiss them. They're going to be they are a platform, right? And let's not forget, these aircraft are not just, they don't just deliver missiles. They are platforms. They are intelligence platforms. They are integrating platforms for information that make you fight smarter, enable you to fight smarter. I believe that the first tranche of trained technicians have just returned to Ukraine, and I think it might have been today. And they will be training their own colleagues in this so that they can maintain these aircraft. And I'm sure it's a little bit aspirational, but I think the Ukrainians are speaking about a summer delivery of F-16s. And this is important. And let's not, again, diminish how important it is to keep morale. Okay, F-16s contributes, gives everybody a boost. It's just like the 61 billion, which we so easily dismiss. I'm told by folks who are on the front lines that there was a cheer. There was an audible cheer when that went through. Over.
No, I definitely don't want to dismiss F-16s. I just feel like there would have been even more tactically useful last year, but certainly they'll be useful in the conflict ahead.
So we have a question more about Canada, which is how does Canada see the security of its northern territories with potential threats from Russia and their claim over North Pole resources, and is the capability of the Canadian Navy sufficient, and what can we learn from the current war in Ukraine and changes in warfare technology in the context of our own north?
So I'd start on that and just offer that I think that's a big focus of the new defense policy, recognizing that security there, defensive considerations are increasingly important. We've been on a trajectory to enhance our northern capability for a while now, but it's all been from a relatively low start state. So there's a lot of room to improve. The government has committed a lot of money to enhance this, but it's going to take time based on past trajectory to actually see that delivered either in terms of new weapon systems or the actual ability to deploy it in a northern context, which has a whole bunch of remote infrastructure implications that are going to take a while to work through. I think if you were to think of one thing, some people had taken some time kind of dismissing the idea of having to be concerned about our north or other strategic moves by the Russians based on what had happened in Ukraine. And as far as I'm aware, their strategic forces have been largely unaffected, or at least and to anywhere near the same extent that their land forces have been in Ukraine. So their Air Force strategic fleets, their long-range bombers, their missile stocks, at least of some kinds, have not been depleted anywhere near as much their vehicle holdings have on one hand. So they have the material assets. I think the other lesson that we should take away from what's happened in Ukraine is that authoritarian dictatorships do things that we don't think make a lot of sense because we have a very difficult time putting ourselves in our paradigm. So we should be worried and prepare for the material threat and less focused about whether or not we think that they have a near-term set of intentions or expectations that they might to use the stockpiles of the gear that they actually have accumulated.
Okay, Dr. Lanushka mentioned the need to make Ukraine an election issue in Canada. How do we do this in today's political climate?
I think David mentioned that.
Yeah, I think that was me.
That's
And
on
I
him.
guess, I guess what I mean by that is a couple of elections ago, at least on my read, the two main political parties were essentially outbidding themselves to be more supportive of Ukraine. I think it would be great to get back to that kind of dynamic where you can get some competitive tension that might unlock a little bit of creativity, which I think we might have been sort of trending towards a creativity deficit here, or at least a willingness to go back and revisit some past assumptions. I think this is an area where some political friction might be, and more explicit political friction might be a little bit useful in terms of prompting some additional types of support. And I mean, I think we've seen that in a lot of ways. Frankly, some media controversy and some political pressure has revisited some rethinking in some areas, which I think could be useful.
Russ, can I just add to that really quickly? Because I think that it's really important to think of Ukraine in two senses. One's Ukraine's victory, sovereign state, territorial integrity, all of that. That's Ukraine, the country Ukraine that we are committed to and committed to through victory. Then there's Ukraine sort of with the small u. And that's Ukraine as a symptom of a world order that is fractured and failing. And I don't know how a country like Canada, with its interrelationship, whether it's in global trade or security or everything else that we have come to know for our standard of life and our prosperity, to not be aware of the fact that you need to invest in defense, that you have to have this renewed awareness that the world is not necessarily the most comfortable place any longer. And so Ukraine in both senses, its victory and Ukraine as a manifestation of a world in transition is something that I think should compel anyone who seeks political office over.
And a related question that I think we're running into our time here in a few minutes. And so I think maybe we'll make this one of the last ones and it's a related question, is what is the best way to help Ukraine for a Canadian resident?
I guess I'd take one stab at it just to build off the last comments. Convince your member of parliament that it's important for the country to live up to the political rhetoric that we've seen from political leaders, that it is important, that it does matter. It matters to us, not just to Ukraine and Ukrainians, and that we should take the whatever it takes for as long as it takes, take that at face value and actually live up to that slogan. Write to your member of parliament, engage with them directly.
And I think so. I have one more question here that I think we will take and then end on, which is about ensuring the success of Ukraine, and that is, what can we do to help transformations inside Ukraine to ensure that it adheres to political standards of NATO countries and that it mobilizes its internal resources. And can Canada play a more proactive role within Ukraine to ensure that Ukraine moves towards democratic and Western standards that will lead to it joining NATO and the EU sooner rather than later?
I'll take a quick stab at that, Oris. Look, I think everybody needs to know that notwithstanding the fact that Ukraine is fighting a war, an existential war in the face of Russian aggression, Ukraine has not stopped on its reform path. And it is everything that is reforming. I just read something the other day again about land reform issues. I know from my work with defense, I'm speaking with the Ministry of Defense all the time on the work they are doing to bring new democratically accountable civilian control of the armed forces, even in the midst of war. Their RADA, their parliament, is working daily on new legislation on everything, whether it's mobilization or benefits for pensioners. I'm not saying it's perfect, but Canada has been there with Ukraine since 2014 and before that on that long-term institutional transformation. And I can tell you that Ukraine is making extraordinary progress. That is why they're in an accession track with the EU. They would not be there were they not making progress on that massive acquis package of reforms that need to be undertaken to be a member of the European Union. So yes, we should stay with them, but let's not forget that Ukraine is doing this in the midst of war. And I think that we should congratulate them for having taken so many definitive steps on the road to consolidating a democratic rule of law approach, notwithstanding the challenges and the scope of what they're dealing with. It's not that there's not more to do, there always is, but they are doing extraordinary work over.
Okay, I think we are running up against our hour here, so I will ask for any final comments from our panelists. And
I just want to just second what Jill had said. And I also think that if you really care about the state of Ukraine democracy, then it's absolutely imperative for it to achieve strategic victory. Ukraine has done remarkably well, all things considered, in terms of going about reform since 2014, especially since 2022. It's a very tough spot to do so, but it will only improve its odds for even greater democratic reform once it achieves victory.
I just one quick thing I would add. I mean, it's really pretty astonishing the number of things that we're asking the country to do concurrently. That I think most places would struggle to do individually, and to do so against an enemy that is not adhering to any of the democratic norms, international humanitarian law. So not only are they, is Ukraine fighting an asymmetric fight in the sense of having to adhere to all of those normative regulations that the opposition does not, it's also having to do all these really difficult internal transformations at the same time. And that's astonishing to be able to do it concurrently.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you to our panelists for what I think was a very useful, timely, and very interesting discussion. Thank you to everyone who attended, our guests today. And as always, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress is always looking for people to help us in our daily work and our advocacy to make sure that Canada is doing everything possible to support Ukrainian victory and to make sure that that victory comes as soon as possible. I will just ask our President Alexandra Hichi to give us a couple of words before we sign off for the evening. Alexandra.
Thank you, Otis. We are indeed very fortunate to have the advice of so many talented and experienced practitioners in this field. I hope that we can continue to call upon you, and my sincere hope that we will not be here a year from now discussing this topic, that we'll be in Kyiv celebrating victory. Дякую.
So thank you all. Дуже дякую, merci, and слава Україні. Until
Героям
next time.
слава.
Thank you.